David, you're under arrest.
I see that, Reynolds.
These cuffs aren't coming off. Your pride will be your downfall.
Move it. Lead on.
A black coffee and a piece of cherry pie. That was all State Senator David Harrison wanted on a quiet Tuesday morning. But to Officer Mitchell Reynolds, a black man in a tailored charcoal suit sitting in Oakmont's most exclusive diner, wasn't a customer. He was a target. In the next 20 minutes, body cams would capture a gross abuse of power. A pair of steel handcuffs clicking shut in a single devastating phone call from the governor's mansion that would end a career forever. Listen closely, because the justice served today is absolute. Oakmont County was the kind of affluent, insulated suburb where the tree canopies perfectly shaded the meticulously paved streets, and the neighborhood watch treated an unfamiliar license plate like a 5-alarm fire. It sat just 40 miles outside the state capitol, a haven for old money and quiet politics. Senator David Harrison, 52 years old, with silver dusting his temples and a mind sharp enough to cut glass, did not live in Oakmont. He represented the 12th District, a bustling, diverse, metropolitan sector that Oakmont's residents only visited when they had tickets to the theater. David was a former civil rights attorney who had climbed the grueling ladder of state politics through sheer grit, unmatched intellect, and an unshakable moral compass. He was currently chairing the state's most powerful judiciary committee. It was 7:15 a.m., clear as throat. David had left his home before dawn to drive to a private breakfast meeting with a key swing vote representative at an Oakmont country club. The meeting had ended early, leaving David with an hour to kill before he needed to be back at the Capitol building for a grueling legislative session. He pulled his black Mercedes S-Class into the lot of the Oakmont Diner, a local institution famous for its stained glass windows, leather booths, and blueberry pancakes. David stepped out of the car. He adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke Italian suit, grabbed his leather briefcase, and walked inside. The bell above the door chimed, a cheerful, innocent sound that momentarily paused the low hum of conversation. The diner was sparsely populated, a few retirees reading the morning paper, a couple of construction foremen getting a heavy breakfast. David took a seat in a corner booth, placing his briefcase gently on the vinyl seat next to him. Sarah, a 20-something waitress with a tired smile, walked over with a menu. "Morning, sir. Coffee to start?" "Black, please, Sarah." "And a slice of the cherry pie if it's not too early for dessert," David said, his voice a rich, resonant baritone. He possessed an inherent dignity, an aura of authority that commanded respect without ever demanding it. "Never too early for pie, honey. Coming right up." Sarah smiled, genuinely warmed by his polite demeanor. David opened his briefcase, pulled out a thick stack of briefing papers regarding an upcoming police reform bill, and clicked his gold fountain pen. For 10 minutes, the world was peaceful. The smell of roasted coffee beans and sizzling bacon filled the air. Then the bell above the door chimed again. Officer Mitchell Reynolds walked in, clear as throat. Reynolds was 45, carrying an extra 20 around his midsection under his tactical vest, and possessed a jaw perpetually set in a resentful scowl. He was a 15-year veteran of the Oakmont Police Department, a big fish in a small manicured pond. Reynolds was infamous in the department for his proactive policing. He saw himself as the gatekeeper of Oakmont, the sheepdog protecting the flock from the wolves. But Reynolds' definition of a wolf was heavily skewed by a deep-seated toxic prejudice. He had an extensive file of civilian complaints, mostly for harassment and excessive force, but the local police union and a sympathetic former chief had always managed to quietly bury them. Reynolds walked in out of the crisp morning air, slapping his leather gloves against his palm. He exchanged a nod with the diner manager, Greg, who was wiping down the counter. "Morning, Mitch, the usual?" Greg asked. "Yeah, Greg. Black coffee to go." Reynolds leaned against the counter, his eyes lazily scanning the room. It was a habit sizing up the environment. His eyes swept past the retirees, past the construction workers, and then his gaze locked onto the corner booth. Reynolds stopped chewing his gum, his eyes narrowed, tracing the lines of the black man in the expensive suit reading documents. He looked out the large front window, spotting the gleaming late-model Mercedes parked directly in front of the diner. Out of county plates in Reynolds' mind, a narrative instantly fabricated itself. Nobody around here dresses like that on a Tuesday morning unless they're going to court. Car's probably leased or worse. Doesn't belong here. The toxic cocktail of arrogance and bias began to simmer in his chest. He didn't see a public servant preparing for a legislative session. He saw an anomaly that needed to be checked, pushed, and reminded of where he was. Sarah walked past Reynolds, carrying David's coffee and a plate of cherry pie. "Who's the guy in the corner?" Reynolds muttered to Sarah as she passed. Sarah stopped, looking confused. "Him? Just a customer." Mitch ordered pie and coffee, very polite. "Yeah, well, I haven't seen him around here." Reynolds grunted, pushing off the counter. He didn't wait for his coffee. He adjusted his utility belt, making sure his radio and sidearm were sitting just right, and began the long, slow walk across the black and white checkered floor towards the corner booth. From his peripheral vision, David saw the uniform approaching. A lifetime in America, coupled with decades as a civil rights lawyer, had honed his situational awareness to a razor's edge. He knew the walk. He knew the posture. It was the aggressive saunter of a man looking for a reason to exercise power. David didn't look up. He took a slow sip of his coffee, turned a page of his briefing, and waited for the shadow to fall over his table. The heavy thud of standard-issue police boots stopped right at the edge of the booth. Reynolds stood uncomfortably close, his hand resting casually but purposefully on his belt right next to his taser. "Morning," Reynolds said. The word was a greeting, but the tone was an interrogation. David calmly finished the sentence he was reading, capped his fountain pen, and finally looked up. He met Reynolds' hard stare with eyes that were perfectly calm yet completely unyielding. "Good morning, officer," David replied smoothly. Reynolds chewed his gum, looking David up and down, then glancing out the window at the Mercedes. "Nice car out there. Yours?" "It is," David answered neutrally. He didn't ask how he could help. He didn't offer a nervous smile. He simply answered the question and waited. This lack of subservience instantly irritated Reynolds. He was used to civilians stammering, over-explaining, or immediately shrinking in his presence. "What brings you to Oakmont?" Reynolds asked, leaning forward slightly, invading David's personal space. "Breakfast?" David said, gesturing to the half-eaten cherry pie. "Don't get smart with me, buddy. I asked you a question. You don't look like you're from around here. I wasn't aware that Oakmont required a local residency to patronize its diners." Officer David trailed off, letting his eyes drop to the nameplate on the uniform. Clear his throat. "Officer Reynolds." Reynolds' face flushed. The quiet, commanding intelligence in David's voice felt like an insult to the cop. "We've had some burglaries in the area lately, high-end neighborhoods, lots of suspicious activity. I'm just doing a routine check. I'm going to need to see some ID." The diner, previously filled with the soft clatter of silverware and quiet chatter, suddenly went dead silent. The retirees at the next table lowered their newspapers. Sarah, the waitress, stopped filling a sugar dispenser at the counter, her eyes wide. Everyone was watching. David did not reach for his wallet. He sat perfectly still. He knew the law in this state better than the man who wrote the police manual. He had literally co-authored the state's revised code on search and seizure. "Officer Reynolds," David said, his voice remaining level, not raising a single decel. "Unless I am mistaken, this state does not have a stop and identify statute that compels a citizen to present identification simply upon request. Furthermore, under Terry versus Ohio, you are required to have a reasonable, articulable suspicion that I have committed, am committing, or am about to commit a crime in order to detain me. Does eating cherry pie while black constitute a reasonable suspicion in Oakmont?" The words hit Reynolds like a physical blow. Nobody talked to him like this ever, especially not the people he usually targeted. The mention of case law, The utter lack of fear and the direct calling out of his racial profiling sent Reynolds into a blind, ego-driven rage. "Listen to me, you arrogant piece of work," Reynolds hissed, dropping all pretense of a friendly check. He slammed his palm flat onto the table, making David's coffee cup rattle. "I don't give a damn about your locker room law degree. I told you we have burglaries. You're driving a $100,000 car. You're out of place and you're refusing a lawful order from a police officer. Now, give me your ID or things are going to get very ugly very fast." Greg, the diner manager, hurried out from behind the counter, wiping his hands nervously on his apron. "Hey, Mitch? Mitch, come on. He's just having breakfast. He paid already. Let's not cause a scene." "Back off, Greg. This is police business," Reynolds barked, not breaking eye contact with David. Greg recoiled, holding his hands up and stepping back, powerless against the badge. David slowly uncrossed his legs and planted his feet firmly on the ground. He looked at the officer's chest. "Is your body camera activated, Officer Reynolds?" Reynolds sneered. "Yeah, it's on. It's going to catch you resisting." "Excellent," David said. "Then let the record show that I am sitting in a public accommodation minding my own business. I have broken no laws. I am not acting suspiciously. You have articulated zero legal justification for demanding my identification. Therefore, I am refusing your unlawful request. Am I free to go, or are you detaining to me?" It was a masterclass in legal verbal judo, and Reynolds had just been pinned. But a man fueled by absolute power and bruised pride rarely thinks clearly. Reynolds saw red. He felt the eyes of the entire diner on him, clear his throat. If he backed down now, he looked weak. He looked like he had been bested by the exact type of man he despised. "Oh, you're not going anywhere," Reynolds growled, stepping back and unsnapping the retention strap on his holster. It was a subtle intimidation tactic, but a deadly one. "You are officially detained for interfering with a police investigation and obstruction." "Stand up." David looked at the unnapped holster. He recognized the lethal danger of the situation. He was a senator, yes, but right now in this diner, he was just a black man facing down an angry, armed police officer. He knew that any sudden movement, any perceived aggression, could end his life. "I will stand," David said slowly, raising his hands so they were clearly visible. "I am complying with your physical orders under duress, but I am stating clearly for your camera that this is an unlawful detention." "Stand the hell up and turn around. Hands behind your back," Reynolds shouted, his voice cracking with adrenaline. David slid out of the booth. He stood up to his full 6'2" height, towering over the stocky officer. The physical disparity only angered Reynolds more. "Turn around," Reynolds yelled, grabbing David roughly by the shoulder and spinning him around toward the table. The physical contact crossed a massive legal and moral threshold. Reynolds roughly shoved David's chest against the edge of the table, knocking over the coffee cup. The dark liquid spilled across the white saucer and soaked into the briefing papers. The very papers detailing the police reform bill David was championing. "Put your hands behind your back now," Reynolds commanded, pressing his forearm aggressively into David's spine. David offered zero physical resistance. He calmly placed his hands behind his back, interlacing his fingers. "I am not resisting, Officer Reynolds. I am fully compliant." Reynolds unhooked his handcuffs from his belt. The sound was distinct and chilling in the quiet diner. Zip, zip, click, click. The heavy, cold steel snapped tightly around David's wrists. Reynolds squeezed the metal cuffs down an extra notch, purposefully making them bite painfully into David's skin. David winced slightly, but did not make a sound. "You have the right to remain silent," Reynolds began, panting slightly as he recited the Miranda warning, yanking David backward by the chain of the cuffs. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The patrons in the diner were in shock. A teenage boy in a booth near the window had his smartphone out, recording the entire interaction. Sarah was covering her mouth with her hands, tears welling in her eyes. It was a grotesque display of raw, unjustified humiliation. "Let's go," Reynolds snarled, grabbing David by the bicep and marching him toward the diner entrance. "Officer," David said calmly as they walked, his voice carrying clearly over the dead silence of the room. You are making a monumental mistake, one that will irrevocably alter the course of your life. Save it for the judge, pal. Reynolds laughed mockingly. I've heard it all before. Every perp thinks they're untouchable. Reynolds shoved the diner door open, pushing David out into the cool morning air. The sun had fully risen now, casting a bright, unforgiving light on the scene in the parking lot. Reynolds marched David toward his cruiser, pressing him hard against the side of the vehicle and aggressively patting him down, spreading David's legs with a harsh kick to his ankles. At that moment, a second Oakmont police cruiser whipped into the parking lot, lights flashing and screeched to a halt. Reynolds had hit his radio panic button during the argument in the diner. Out stepped Officer Jenkins. Jenkins was 24, a rookie fresh out of the academy, and unlike Reynolds, he still possessed a conscience. He jogged over, his hand resting on his duty belt. Mitch, what's going on? You hit the button, Jenkins said, assessing the scene. He looked at the impeccably dressed, handcuffed, Clear's throat. Man pressed against the squad car, and then at the pristine S-Class nearby. Something immediately felt wrong to the young officer. Got a non-compliant suspect here, Jenkins, Reynolds said, proudly out of breath. Refused to ID, matched the profile for the burglaries, resisted detainment. Obstruction, Clear's throat. I'm taking him in. Jenkins looked at David. David turned his head, resting his cheek against the cold metal of the police car, and looked directly into the rookie's eyes. Officer, David said to Jenkins. His voice was no longer just polite. It was the booming, commanding voice of a state senator who commanded rooms of hundreds of people. My name is David Harrison. Your senior officer has unlawfully assaulted and arrested me without cause. Since he is intent on booking me, I suggest you retrieve my identification. It is in the inside left breast pocket of my suit jacket. Reynolds laughed, a harsh, grating sound. Oh, now he wants to show ID. Too late for that, buddy. You'll be identified at the station when we run your prints. Jenkins, however, felt a cold knot form in his stomach. The man didn't sound like a burglar. He sounded like a judge. Mitch, Jenkins said hesitantly. Let me just check his pocket. Protocol says we should identify before transport if possible. Reynolds rolled his eyes. Fine. Check his fancy suit. Probably got a fake ID in there anyway. Jenkins stepped forward. Excuse me, sir, he said respectfully, reaching into the inner pocket of David's Bryan jacket. His fingers brushed against a thick premium leather wallet. He pulled it out and flipped it open. There, sitting behind a clear plastic window, was not a standard driver's license. It was a solid gold, beautifully embossed identification card. At the top, in bold, unmistakable lettering, it read, State Senate. Below that, a high-quality photograph of the man currently in handcuffs. And below the photo, Senator David Harrison, Chair, Judiciary Committee. Jenkins stopped breathing, the blood completely drained from his face, leaving him a sickly, pale white. His hands began to visibly shake. He stared at the card, read the words 3 times, and then slowly raised his eyes to look at the man pressed against the hood of the car. Mitch, Jenkins stammered, his voice cracking completely. What? Reynolds snapped, adjusting his belt. He got warrants. Tell me he's got warrants. Jenkins turned the wallet around, holding it out with trembling fingers so Reynolds could see the gold shield and the bold letters. Mitch, Jenkins whispered, absolute terror laced in his words. He's a state senator. Reynolds froze. The arrogant smirk vanished from his face, replaced by a sudden, sickening slackness. He stared at the gold card. He read the name Harrison. The man who basically controlled the state's law enforcement budget, the man who was leading the police reform task force. The cold morning breeze suddenly felt like ice against Reynolds' skin. For the first time in 15 years, Officer Mitchell Reynolds realized he had just destroyed his own life. David Harrison turned his head, looking at Reynolds with eyes as cold and deep as the ocean. Like I said, Officer Reynolds, David spoke softly. A monumental mistake. The silence in the diner parking lot was absolute, broken only by the low, steady idle of the Oakmont police cruisers. Officer Jenkins stood frozen, the gold state Senate identification card trembling in his hand. He looked like a man who had just pulled the pin on a grenade and realized his fingers were glued to it. Officer Mitchell Reynolds stared at the embossed gold lettering. The blood pounded in his ears, a deafening rush that drowned out the morning birds. His mind desperately clawed for a lifeline, a loophole, a way to spin this. In 15 years on the force, he had bullied, intimidated, and railroaded dozens of people who lacked the resources to fight back. He relied on the badge to act as an impenetrable shield against consequences. But this wasn't a teenager from the wrong side of the tracks. This was Senator David Harrison, the man who sat on the state's Budget Appropriations Committee, the man who could freeze the pension funds of entire municipal departments with a single stroke of his pen. "Mitch," Jenkins whispered again, his voice hollow. "Take the cuffs off, right now. Take them off and apologize." For a fleeting second, self-preservation almost won out. Reynolds' hand twitched toward his belt to retrieve the handcuff keys, but then the toxic, fragile ego that had driven him his entire life violently reasserted itself. The teenager in the diner window was still filming. The retirees were watching. If he uncuffed David now, he was admitting fault on camera. He would be admitting that he had racially profiled, unlawfully detained, and assaulted a sitting state senator. His career would be over anyway. In Reynolds' twisted logic, the only way out was straight through. He had to stand his ground. He had to make the obstruction charge stick, hoping the police union lawyers could muddy the waters enough to save his pension. "No," Reynolds said, his voice dropping to a stubborn, defensive growl. He snatched the wallet out of Jenkins's hand and shoved it into his own vest pocket. "Nobody is above the law, Jenkins. Not even politicians." He refused a lawful order to identify himself during an active burglary investigation. That's obstruction of justice. He's going to the station. Jenkins looked at his senior officer in sheer, unadulterated horror. "Are you insane? You had no probable cause. Mitch, this is false arrest. This is a federal civil rights violation. Shut up, rookie," Reynolds barked, turning his back on Jenkins. He grabbed David by the arm again, shoving him roughly toward the rear door of the cruiser. "Watch your head." David did not resist. He ducked his head and slid onto the hard plastic bench of the squad car. He looked up at Reynolds through the open door. There was no fear in the senator's eyes. There was only a cold, clinical observation. "I want you to remember this exact moment, Officer Reynolds," David said evenly, the handcuffs biting painfully into his wrists as he shifted his weight. "Your colleague just offered you a chance to mitigate your damages. You chose to double down on a felony civil rights violation under the color of law. You are no longer just losing your badge, you are looking at a federal indictment." Reynolds slammed the cruiser door shut, cutting off David's voice. He stormed around to the driver's side, his breathing heavy, his face flushed a mottled, angry red. He slid behind the wheel and slammed the car into gear. Jenkins didn't move toward his own car. He stood in the parking lot, pulling out his personal cell phone. His hands were shaking so badly he dropped it once before dialing the emergency direct line to the precinct's desk. "Sergeant," he knew he had to get ahead of this before Reynolds dragged the entire department down into the abyss with him. Inside Reynolds' cruiser, the air was thick and suffocating. The plexiglass partition separated the arrogant officer from his captive, but the tension radiated through the barrier. Reynolds drove aggressively, taking corners too fast, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He was trying to project authority, but the heavy silence from the back seat was tearing his nerves to shreds. Most suspects yelled, they cried, they begged, or they swore. David Harrison did none of those things. He sat perfectly upright, his posture impeccable despite his hands being bound behind his back. He was mentally logging every detail. The time of arrest, 7:34 a.m., clear his throat. The car number, car 14. The route taken, the speed at which Reynolds was driving. David was building the federal lawsuit in his head, brick by undeniable brick. "You think you're pretty smart, don't you?" Reynolds sneered, looking at David in the rear view mirror. He couldn't handle the silence. Think that shiny gold card gives you a free pass to disrespect law enforcement? I think, David replied calmly, his voice projecting clearly through the partition. Great. That the Constitution of the United States applies to everyone, regardless of what neighborhood they are having breakfast in. A concept you seem fundamentally incapable of grasping. We'll see how cocky you are when you're in a holding cell, Reynolds snapped back, hitting the siren to blow through a red light unnecessarily. 5 minutes later, the cruiser pulled into the secured rear sally port of the Oakmont Police Department. It was a modest, brick-faced building, usually dealing with noise complaints, minor vandalism, and traffic violations. It was completely unequipped for the political hurricane that was currently sitting in the back of car 14. Reynolds got out, opened the rear door, and hauled David out by his jacket collar. "Move," he ordered. They walked through the heavy steel doors into the booking area. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The room smelled of floor wax and stale coffee. At the raised booking desk sat Sergeant William Brawdy, a 30-year veteran who was 3 months away from a quiet retirement. He was drinking coffee and reading a sports magazine. He looked up as the heavy doors clanged shut. "Morning, Mitch. What do we got?" Brodie asked casually, setting his magazine down. He typed his password into the booking computer. "Burglary suspect obstruction and resisting," Reynolds said loudly, marching David to the booking counter. "Refused to ID, became belligerent." Brodie looked at the man in the handcuffs. He took in the ruined coffee-stained Italian wool suit, the impeccable grooming, and the calm, authoritative demeanor. Brodie frowned. In his 3 decades on the job, he had developed a sixth sense for when things were wrong. This felt catastrophically wrong. "Name?" "Clears throat," Brodie asked, looking at David. Before David could answer, the rear sally port doors burst open. "Clears throat." Officer Jenkins sprinted into the booking room, completely out of breath, his uniform disheveled. Sarge, stop," Jenkins yelled, waving his hands frantically. Brodie stood up, his hand dropping to his radio. "Jenkins, what the hell is the matter with you? Catch your breath." Jenkins ran up to the desk, ignoring Reynolds, and looked directly at Brodie. "Don't book him, Sarge. Do not put him in the system." "What are you talking about?" Reynolds snarled, stepping toward Jenkins. "I'm the arresting officer. Back off." Jenkins turned and pointed a trembling finger at Reynolds. He unlawfully detained him. "No probable cause, Sarge. I was there. I saw the whole thing. And..." Clears throat. Jenkins swallowed hard, turning to look at David. "Tell him who you are, sir." David stepped forward, his hands still cuffed behind his back. He looked up at Sergeant Brawdy. "My name is State Senator David Harrison," David said, his voice echoing in the quiet booking room. "I am the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, and I have just been abducted by your officer." Brodie stared at David, the color instantly drained from the old sergeant's face. He knew that name. Every cop in the state knew that name. Clears throat. Brodie looked at Reynolds, his eyes wide with a mixture of rage and absolute dread. "Mitch, tell me you didn't." Reynolds jutted his chin out. "He refused an order, Sarge. I'm doing my job." Brodie slammed his fist onto the booking desk, the loud crack making both officers jump. "You stupid, arrogant son of a," Brodie roared. "Get the captain down here right now." Captain Tobias Miller was in the middle of his morning briefing in the upstairs precinct offices when his desk phone blared the emergency internal ring. Annoyed, he picked it up. 10 seconds later, the precinct captain was sprinting down the stairwell, nearly tripping over his own boots. Miller burst into the booking room to find a scene of utter paralysis. Senator David Harrison was standing silently at the counter. Officer Jenkins was leaning against the wall, looking physically ill. Officer Reynolds was standing rigidly, his arms crossed, desperately trying to project defiance, while sweat beaded on his forehead. And Sergeant Brodie was standing behind the desk, holding his head in his hands. Captain Miller stopped dead in his tracks. He had attended a state law enforcement funding gala just 3 months prior. He had shaken Senator Harrison's hand. He recognized the man instantly. "Dear God in heaven," Miller breathed out. He rushed forward, pushing Reynolds aside so hard the larger officer stumbled. Miller stopped right in front of David. "Senator Harrison," Miller said, his voice laced with profound panic. "Sir, I am Captain Miller. I cannot begin to express." "Captain," David interrupted, his voice frigid and exact, "take these handcuffs off me immediately." "Case! Give me the damn keys!" Miller screamed, turning on Reynolds. Reynolds, finally realizing that his Union shield was not going to protect him from the precinct captain, fumbled nervously at his belt. He handed the small silver key to Miller. Miller's hands shook as he reached behind David, inserted the key, and unlocked the heavy steel cuffs. Click, click. The cuffs fell away. David brought his arms forward slowly. His wrists were bruised and angry red, the metal having dug deeply into his skin. He casually straightened his jacket sleeves, adjusting his cuffs over the abrasions. He did not rub them. He did not show pain. He simply looked at Captain Miller. "Senator, please come into my office," Miller pleaded, gesturing toward the secure hallway. "Let me get you a fresh coffee. Let's sit down and clear this up. This is a massive misunderstanding." "It is not a misunderstanding, Captain Miller. It is a crime," David replied, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "I will not sit in your office. I will stand right here, and I have 3 immediate demands." "Anything? Anything you need, Senator?" David pointed a finger at Sergeant Brody. "First, you will immediately sequester Officer Reynolds' body camera. You will pull the server drive and place it into an evidence bag in my presence. If a single frame of that footage goes missing or is corrupted, I will personally see to it that the FBI tears this precinct apart down to the foundation." "Sarge, do it now. Pull the drive," Miller ordered instantly. Brody began furiously typing at his terminal. "Second," David continued, turning his gaze to Reynolds, who was now visibly shrinking against the wall. "Officer Reynolds is to be stripped of his badge, his service weapon, and his police powers immediately, pending a full internal and state-level investigation." "You can't do that," Reynolds shouted, panic finally breaking through his arrogant facade. "On rules dictate." "Shut your mouth, Reynolds," Miller roared, his face purple with fury. "Give me your gun now and your badge. You're suspended without pay, effective this exact second." Reynolds stared at the captain in disbelief. The safety net was gone. Slowly, with shaking hands, he unbuckled his duty belt and handed it over, followed by the gold shield pinned to his chest. He looked small suddenly, stripped of his weapons and his authority. He was just an angry, frightened man who had picked a fight with a titan and lost. "And third," David said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet register, "I want my phone. It is in my briefcase, which is currently in the front seat of Officer Reynolds' cruiser." "Jenkins, get the senator's briefcase," Miller snapped. Jenkins sprinted out the Sallyport door. Within 30 seconds, Jenkins returned, carrying the expensive leather briefcase. He handed it to David as if it were made of glass. David placed the briefcase on the booking counter. He clicked the brass locks open, reached inside, and pulled out his smartphone. He ignored the dozen unread messages from his staff, wondering why he wasn't at the Capitol yet. "Are you calling your attorney, Senator?" Miller asked nervously, wringing his hands. "Because we can have the city attorney down here in 10 minutes to—" "I am an attorney, Captain," David said sharply. "I don't need counsel. I need the executive branch." David unlocked his phone, bypassed his contacts list, and dialed a private, unlisted number that only a handful of people in the state possessed. He put the phone to his ear. The booking room was dead silent. Even the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to quiet down. Reynolds watched, his stomach dropping into a bottomless void as he realized exactly who the senator was calling. The phone rang twice, then a crisp, professional voice answered. "XA, Chief of Staff speaking." "Brian," David said smoothly. "It's David Harrison. Senator, we were just wondering where you were. The committee session starts in 20 minutes. The governor is asking for you." "I'm going to be slightly delayed, Brian. Please patch me through to Richard immediately." There was a brief pause on the line. The chief of staff caught the deadly serious tone in David's voice. "Putting you through now, David." A click. Then, the deep, recognizable voice of Governor Richard Hayes came over the line. "Richard." "David, good morning. Tell me you've got Representative Cole's vote locked down for the reform bill." "Richard," David said, his eyes locking onto Officer Reynolds, who was now leaning against the wall, looking physically sick. "I do have the vote, but we have a more pressing issue regarding the police reform initiative, specifically a demonstration of exactly why we need it." "What's going on, David? You don't sound like you're at the Capitol." "I'm not," David replied. "I'm currently standing in the booking room of the Oakmont Police Department. 10 minutes ago, I was physically assaulted, unlawfully arrested, and handcuffed in a public diner by one of their officers for the crime of drinking coffee while black." The silence on the other end of the line was profound. When the governor finally spoke, the easygoing political charm was completely gone, replaced by the chilling, ruthless authority of the state's highest executive. "Who is the commanding officer in the room with you right now?" the governor asked, his voice like cracking ice. David looked at Captain Miller, who was currently sweating through his uniform shirt. "Captain Tobias Miller," David answered. "Put him on speakerphone," the governor commanded. David pulled the phone away from his ear, tapped the speaker icon, and set the phone gently on the booking counter. "Governor Hayes, you are on speakerphone with Captain Miller," David announced. Captain Miller leaned over the counter, his voice trembling. "Governor Hayes?" "Good morning, sir." "Captain Miller." The governor's voice echoed loudly through the small, sterile room. "Let me be perfectly clear, so there is no ambiguity. You have exactly 5 seconds to explain to me why the chairman of my Judiciary Committee is standing in your booking room with bruised wrists, or I'm going to dispatch the State Police Tactical Unit to relieve you of your command and take over your precinct." In the corner of the room, stripped of his badge and his gun, Mitchell Reynolds closed his eyes. He realized with absolute terrifying clarity that the world, as he knew it, had just violently ended. "Governor Push," Captain Miller stammered, the sweat now visibly soaking through the collar of his uniform. It was an isolated incident, an unapproved rogue action by Officer Reynolds. "I have already stripped him of his badge and weapon. He is suspended." "Suspended?" Governor Richard Hayes' voice echoed from the phone speaker, vibrating with barely contained fury. "Captain, you are talking about the chairman of the State Judiciary Committee, the man who is single-handedly rewriting the state's law enforcement code. You don't suspend a man who kidnaps a state senator. You arrest him. I'm dispatching State Attorney General Robert Kensington and a unit of the state police to your location right now. Secure the building. Nobody leaves. Not you, not your desk, Sergeant. And certainly not the disgraced officer in the corner." "Yes, Governor." "Understood completely, sir." Miller choked out, his eyes darting around his own booking room as if the walls were closing in on him. "David." The governor's tone softened slightly, shifting from executive wrath to political alliance. "Are you injured? Do you need paramedics? I am bruised, Richard." "But I'm fine," David replied, picking up his phone and taking it off speaker. "I'm going to remain here until the Attorney General arrives. I want a full chain of custody established on the body camera footage. Kensington is leaving the Capitol now with an escort. He'll be there in 20 minutes. Give them hell, David." "Always," David said, and ended the call. He slipped the phone back into his tailored jacket pocket. The silence that fell over the precinct booking room was absolute and suffocating. Officer Jenkins looked like he might vomit. Sergeant Brody was typing furiously at his terminal, ensuring the server logs for the body camera data were permanently locked down and archived, and then the heavy security doors from the precinct lobby swung violently open. In walked Arthur Stanton, the regional representative for the Police Benevolent Association. Stanton was a bulldog of a man in a cheap gray suit known throughout the county for aggressively shielding bad cops from accountability. He had received a frantic text from Reynolds while David was being uncuffed. Stanton stormed into the room, chest puffed out, carrying a faux leather briefcase. He didn't look at David. He looked straight at Captain Miller. Captain Stanton barked. his voice loud and obnoxious. "I'm formally invoking my client's garrity rights. Officer Reynolds is not to be questioned. I hear you've taken his badge without a formal union hearing. That's a direct violation of the collective bargaining agreement, Tom, and you know it. We're going to sue this department for breach of contract, and we're walking out of here right now." Stanton turned to Reynolds, gesturing toward the door. "Come on, Mitch. Don't say a word to anyone. We're leaving." Reynolds didn't move. He stood plastered against the cinder block wall, his eyes wide and hollow. He looked at Stanton, then slowly pointed a trembling finger at the black man, standing casually by the booking desk. Stanton finally turned to look at David. He looked him up and down, noting the spilled coffee on the expensive suit and the red raw indentations on his wrists. Stanton sneered, assuming this was just another civilian complaint that he could steamroll. "Is this the guy?" Stanton asked dismissively. "Look, pal, whatever you think happened out there, my officer was acting within his discretionary authority. If you want to file a civilian complaint, there's a form in the lobby, but my client is leaving." David slowly closed his briefcase and rested both hands on top of it. He looked at the union rep with a gaze so piercing it made Stanton instinctively take a half step back. "Mr. Stanton, isn't it?" David asked. His voice was a quiet, dangerous rumble. "Yeah. Arthur Stanton, PBA representative." "And you are?" "My name is Senator David Harrison. I chair the committee that determines whether your union's pension fund receives its state-matched contributions next fiscal year." Stanton's jaw physically dropped. The obnoxious bravado evaporated in a millisecond. His eyes darted to Captain Miller, who gave a grim, slow nod. "Oh my God," Stanton whispered, the blood draining from his face. "Your client," David continued, his voice echoing off the tile walls, "is not leaving this building. In fact, the governor of this state has just dispatched the attorney general and a state police tactical squad to lock down this facility. Your client unlawfully detained me, physically assaulted me, and committed a felony civil rights violation, all while on camera." David took a slow step toward Stanton, towering over the union rep. "So, Mr. Stanton, you can invoke whatever administrative rights you like, but your client is no longer facing an internal affairs review. He is facing a federal indictment. And if you attempt to obstruct this investigation in any way, I will personally ensure that you are named as a co-conspirator in the DOJ probe. Do we understand each other?" Stanton swallowed hard, his throat clicking audibly in the quiet room. He slowly backed away from Reynolds. The Union Brotherhood was strong, but Arthur Stanton was not about to go to federal prison for a racist patrolman. "I understand, Senator," Stanton mumbled, shrinking back into the corner. He didn't look at Reynolds again. 15 minutes later, the screech of tires echoed through the precinct's rear lot. Heavy boots pounded up the steps. 4 heavily armed state troopers in full tactical gear entered the booking room, led by a tall, sharp-eyed man in a dark navy suit. It was Robert Kensington, the state attorney general. Kensington bypassed the local officers completely and walked straight to David, extending his hand. "Senator Harrison, I apologize for the delay. The governor briefed me on the way down." "Thank," clears throat. "You, Robert?" David said, shaking his hand firmly. "The primary evidence is the body camera footage from Officer Reynolds. Sergeant Brody has isolated the drive." Kensington nodded, then turned to his troopers. "Secure the perimeter. Nobody enters or exits without my direct authorization." He turned his piercing gaze to Captain Miller. "Captain, we are taking over my command center in your main briefing room. I want the body camera footage queued up on the projector immediately. All officers involved in this arrest will be present. The precinct's upstairs briefing room was designed for morning roll calls, not state-level tribunals. The fluorescent lights were dimmed. At the front of the room, a large projection screen was pulled down. Senator David Harrison sat in the front row, his arms crossed. Next to him sat Attorney General Kensington. Behind them stood Captain Miller, Officer Jenkins, and a thoroughly defeated Arthur Stanton. In the center of the room, seated in a hard plastic chair and flanked by 2 state troopers, was Mitchell Reynolds. He was shaking. The adrenaline had completely worn off, leaving behind nothing but the cold, nauseating terror of utter ruin. "Play the footage, Sergeant," Kensington ordered. Sergeant Brody, sitting at the precinct's media computer, clicked the mouse. The screen flickered to life. It was Reynolds' perspective, complete with the timestamp in the upper right corner. The audio kicked in, the chime of the diner bell, the low murmur of conversation. They watched as Reynolds approached the corner booth. They heard his aggressive, unwarranted questioning. Nobody around here dresses like that on a Tuesday morning unless they're going to court. They watched David's calm, legally flawless refusal to provide identification. They saw Reynolds lose his temper, slamming his hand on the table, the coffee spilling over the legislative documents. "Oh, you're not going anywhere. You are officially detained." The room watched in deafening silence as Reynolds physically assaulted the senator, shoving him against the table, the sickening click, click of the handcuffs echoing through the speakers. Attorney General Kensington's face was a mask of cold fury. He was taking furious notes on a legal pad. The footage showed the march to the police cruiser. It showed Officer Jenkins arriving and discovering the gold Senate A, showed Reynolds deliberately ignoring the revelation, choosing instead to double down on his abuse of power. But it was what happened next that turned a terrible situation into a catastrophic one for the Oakmont Police Department. On the screen, Reynolds slammed the cruiser door shut, trapping David in the back. Reynolds then walked around the front of his car. Officer Jenkins was standing there looking panicked. The body camera audio was crisp and unforgiving. "Mitch, this is false arrest. This is a federal civil rights violation." Jenkins pleaded on the video. Reynolds' voice hissed back, laced with arrogant malice. "Shut up, rookie. Just do what we always do. We'll write it up like the Jackson kid. Sprinkle a little powder in the floorboards at the impound. Say he matched the description of a fleeing suspect and lock him up. Judges in this county believe anything I write. We own this town." The video paused. The silence in the briefing room was no longer just tense. It was lethal. David slowly turned his head to look at Captain Miller. Miller looked like he had been shot in the chest. "Captain," David said, his voice deadly quiet. "Who is the Jackson kid?" Miller couldn't speak. He was hyperventilating. Attorney General Kensington stood up slowly. He looked at Reynolds, who was now openly weeping, his face buried in his hands. "The Jackson kid," Kensington said, answering for the captain. "Marcus Jackson, 18 years old, arrested by Officer Reynolds 6 months ago for narcotics possession and resisting arrest. He's currently serving 3 years in the state penitentiary. He claimed the drugs were planted. The department cleared Reynolds of any wrongdoing." David stood up. He walked over to where Reynolds was sitting. The 2 state troopers tensed, but David simply looked down at the sobbing man. "You didn't just profile me, officer." Clear his throat. "Reynolds," David said, his voice echoing with the weight of absolute justice. "You revealed a systemic pattern of corruption, evidence tampering, and perjury. You thought your badge was a shield, but all it did was record your confession." David turned to the Attorney General. "Robert, I don't just want this man arrested. I want the Department of Justice to tear this entire precinct apart. I want every single arrest report Mitchell Reynolds has filed in the last 15 years audited. I want the Jackson Boy case reopened by tomorrow morning. And I want the mayor of this city in my office by 5 p.m. today." "Consider it done, Senator," Kensington said firmly. He gestured to the troopers. "Arrest Mr. Reynolds. Book him on false imprisonment, assault under the color of law, official misconduct, and conspiracy to commit evidence tampering." The troopers pulled Reynolds to his feet. The man who had terrorized Oakmont for a decade and a half didn't resist. He was broken. The heavy steel of the trooper's handcuffs clicked around his wrists. The poetic justice of the sound was not lost on anyone in the room. As they marched Reynolds out of the briefing room, David picked up his briefcase. He looked at Officer Jenkins, who was still standing by the wall, trembling but standing tall. "Officer Jenkins," David said. Jenkins snapped to attention. "Yes, sir. You did the right thing today. You tried to stop it. When the state takes over this department, and we will take it over, we will be looking for officers with integrity to rebuild it." Keep your record clean. I will, Senator. Thank you, Jenkins whispered. David Harrison walked out of the briefing room, down the stairs, and out the front doors of the Oakmont Police Department. The mid-morning sun was shining brightly. His black Mercedes had been driven over from the diner and was waiting for him at the curb, keys in the ignition, courtesy of a terrified desk sergeant. David opened his briefcase, pulled out the coffee-stained briefing papers on the police reform bill, and smoothed them out on the roof of his car. He didn't need the papers anymore. He had all the evidence he needed to pass the bill unanimously. He slid into the driver's seat, adjusted his tie, and drove toward the state capitol. Justice had been served in Oakmont. But for Senator David Harrison, the real work was just beginning. Absolute power corrupts. But true justice always leaves a paper trail, or in this case, body cam footage. Officer Reynolds thought his badge made him untouchable, but he picked a fight with the wrong man and lost everything. The system only changes when we drag the truth into the light. If you loved watching arrogance get absolutely dismantled by intellect and authority, hit that like button. Share this story with anyone who loves seeing karma served hot. And make sure to subscribe for more intense, real-life drama stories. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in the senator's